Welcome, everyone. We are excited to lead this panel. This is part two. The first panel was held in January with different panelists, also from different parts of the world. And now, as we are closer to the election date and we know who the running mates are, who the actual candidates are, we're having a second run analyzing the election dynamics. So we know how important these elections are, not just for the United States, but for the whole world. And we know also that so much is happening astrologically. And so I hope that we will be able to provide more clarity, better understanding, and the great opportunity here is that we have astrologers not just from different countries, but who each offer a different perspective using different techniques um, and methods, which I hope you're going to be able to share, uh, each one of you, what you're actually doing as you reach your conclusions. So this is not necessarily about, betting on the winning horse, though some of us may have strong convictions about who is going to win. But generally speaking, we want to look at the dynamics. There's so much that can happen and change and reverse the fortune and reverse the trends. Um, so we keep things also open, but it's important to analyze and understand what is going on. We're going to look at the election day, which is November 5th, and also glance at the inauguration day, which is January 20th, 2025. So with us tonight are Richard Fidler from currently the UK. He's based in the UK now, originally from South Africa. And Richard is a professional consulting astrologer and teacher with 30 years of experience, an eclectic combination. His approach is combining Western and Vedic astrology, has organized and lectured at conferences on several continents, and his work has been published in a number of leading journals, including Mountain Astrologer, ESA's Journal, and the AA Journal. He has served as the chairman of the Cape Town Astrology Association and ESA's global director for the UK. His website, richardfidler.com. So welcome. Richard's going to go first, and then we're going to sequence in with Bill Meridian and just read, I'm going to introduce Bill. I'm going to introduce everyone now so that we know who we're working with. Bill Meridian holds a BS MBA degrees from NYU and has worked on the stock market since 1966, began studying astrology in 72, has twice been ranked Market Timer of the Year by Timer Digest, and was ranked number 3 over 19 years versus 160 services. Bill was advisor to legendary Wall Street trader Frankie Joe for 12 years. He trained to be a core energetic therapist with Dr. John Pierakos in New York City for 9 years. He studied Zen at Wellspring Monastery. His interpretive work is a combination of his training in core energetics and Zen practice. 4 books are Planetary Stock Trade, Planetary Economic Forecasting, Predictive Power of Eclipse Path, and Mastering Geopolitical Prediction. He currently runs an investment business from his home in Vienna and the USA. Bill is a member of the board of the Foundation of the Study of Cycles. Website, billmeridian.com. Thank you for joining us, Bill. And
Thank you.
I'm going to then be the third one, and most of you may know me, leading evolutionary astrologer, travel a lot, teach everywhere. Now I'm back home after a long journey, and I'm both doing private consultation, but also enjoy doing the mundane analysis, looking at global trend, which you can follow on my YouTube channel and my Facebook group, which is called Evolutionary Skies. And Julia from the USA, from Australia.
Have I moved?
We're going to move you. Agent, I mean, CIA, it's confusing.
Yes.
Agent 12, Julija Simas, is the founder and chief at the Cosmic Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Julia has been practicing, circulating, and teaching astrology since starting the CIA in 2005, having lectured online and in many parts of the globe at various conferences and schools. Agent 12 devotes most of her time to the CIA, managing membership, content, and speakers, as well as doing her own research, client work, and managing social media channel. And now the Time Lord online magazine, cosmicintelligenceagency.com. So very excited to have Julia on board because she's a sharp mind who's always bringing, different ideas and wonderful research. So before, thank you. Before Richard gets started, I just want to show the chart for the election day. I think we covered that, in the previous part one, but some of you may not have watched that episode. So it's an interesting chart. I'm using here midnight, so 0 hour of November 6th, because that's the closing polls in Hawaii. I chose not to do the opening of the vote because voting starts early. Some people are starting to vote already in October. So I didn't know, what would be the actual starting day time for that. But the closing poll for this chart, and other panelists may use another chart. This is just what I have presented here. And as you can see, the sun, obviously in Scorpio, trines Saturn. Mars, infamously opposes Pluto. The exact opposition is at 29 Cancer Capricorn 2 days prior, November 3rd. So just as Mars moves into Leo, the election, is the election day. Another interesting thing that I often pay attention to is where the moon is. That day, the moon is in Capricorn. And it's interesting because none of the candidates are Capricorns or have Capricorn moons. But interestingly, there's both their spouses too. Melania Trump has a Capricorn moon, and Doug Hermoff, Kamala's husband, is a Capricorn moon. So whatever that means. So on this note, I will stop sharing and pass the mic to Richard.
Oh.
And if we could all mute ourselves, other panelists.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm sure many of you have been struck by the fact that Trump and Harris were both born at a full moon. In both cases, really strikingly tight orb, the sun-moon opposition. And, it's also kind of curious that that angle of that sun-moon opposition in relation to the ascendant in both cases is kind of similar. And, interesting that in the male chart, the sun is above the horizon. In the female chart, the moon is above the horizon. There's a curious equivalence, that sort of strikes me here in these two charts. It's also interesting to see that Trump's sun and node are pretty close to Kamala's ascendant node. I'm not quite sure what this will mean. I don't think it really gives us any glimpse into the outcome. But there's again this curious equivalence. Now, I thought I'd start with a bit of a review of what was going on in Trump's chart when he won in 2016. Because, I think the picture is actually quite different for him this time around. The first thing that I find kind of interesting about what was going on for him in 2016 was the fact that Saturn was not too far from being in his sun-moon axis, albeit that the orb was not particularly tight. But for me, it's an example of the fact that, one can actually win something like an election like this under pretty strong Saturn influences. In fact, it's not uncommon. Saturn, despite being a planet that obstructs, is also, the planet that can, in a sense, take you highest to the highest levels of achievement. Also around that time in 2016, when Trump won, transiting Uranus was trine his moon and sextile his sun. Now, I wouldn't say that this is something that makes you particularly lucky or unlucky, but with Uranus in these, let's call them easy aspects to the sun and moon, you're more likely to have pleasant surprises than unpleasant surprises. There's a pleasantly stimulating fast pace to events, and things kind of go your way. Kind of also keeps you kind of sharp. Also at that time, there was a Jupiter-Pluto square in the heavens that was connecting to his ascendant with 45-degree multiple angles. In other words, Jupiter was semi-square his ascendant and Pluto sesquiquadrate his ascendant. Also, that Jupiter was there with just within a degree of semi-square his Mars. And, I found Jupiter-Pluto and Jupiter-Mars combinations are often a signature of becoming empowered or winning, being victorious. Particularly Jupiter-Mars combinations, I find, are often the signature of victory. If anybody engaged in any kind of competition has that active. And, with Jupiter-Pluto, you have this idea of wielding power, and particularly wielding it in a manner that is, very forceful. Anyway, these factors, I think, really helped him that time. Also, Mars at the time was forming a very nearly exact quincunx to his ascendant. Now, I've just used regular standard settings here, tropical zodiac, Placidus houses. But in Vedic astrology, there's a house system called the Bhava Chalit, the house system or method, in which basically Mars here would be at the epicenter of the sixth house, right? And I think this is a significant peripheral fact. And I think it's particularly notable in light of where Mars is going to be this time around for him. Also back then, Trump had progressed Sun conjunct his ascendant. And, I remember at the time looking at that and thinking that it looked really strong for him. And, I think back then, I, like many other astrologers, couldn't get my head around the idea that Trump could possibly win, that it could possibly happen, that he could become president. But there were actually, in retrospect, so many clear signatures of that. Another thing that was happening in his secondary progressions is that he had progressed Jupiter, squaring his natal Saturn, I mean, just within a few minutes of exact, with a secondary progressed moon, plugging into that combination and highlighting it. And, I've found, at least with transits, when you have transiting Jupiter aspecting natal Saturn, it tends to be something that's more likely to bring about a breakthrough compared to transiting Saturn as in a hard aspect to natal Jupiter. Now, I know these are progressions, not transits, but I personally think the same principle applies. So I think this particular element in his secondary progressions back in 2016 was yet another relatively helpful factor. Also, very strikingly, another very strong Pluto-Jupiter signature in Trump's solar arc progressions in particular in 2016. Solar arc Pluto conjunct his natal Jupiter within 6 minutes of exact. Okay, so we have two Jupiter-Pluto signatures here in Trump's case back in 2016. Lastly, from a Vedic astrology perspective, it really sort of pokes you in the eye that Trump began the 16 years of Jupiter Dasha on the 15th of November 2016, just a few days after the election. And, I found that these major periods of Vedic astrology are often noticeable even some months before they technically begin. Now, Jupiter basically as a benefic in the most basic level of interpretation already would indicate some promise for him there. But at the time, he was having a Jupiter return, which is another strong, positive influence for him back then. And in Vedic astrology, Jupiter very specifically aspects the 5th and 9th houses from its position. So when Jupiter's in the 2nd house, it literally aspects the 10th house, and in his case, also the sun. So his Vedic astrology chart also had just a lot of the first glance factors were very supportive back then of him winning. All right, so let's look at what's happening for Kamala this time around. Now, one of the things that I find really striking and somewhat comparable to that Saturn Moon conjunction and Saturn Sun opposition that Trump had when he won in 2016 is the fact that transiting Saturn is stationing semi-square Kamala's moon and sesquiquadrate her sun. And this is really tricky because, of course, the most basic and superficial interpretation of this would mean some sort of, I don't know, disappointment, obstruction, loss, all of those very basic ideas. But again, with Saturn in this particular type of setting, where we're talking about politics, where we're talking about very high office, where we're talking about assuming a very serious and weighty responsibility, it's not so clear-cut how we interpret this. It's definitely important. It's definitely key, but it's not so easy to say what this means. But this strikes me as very significant, and certainly is telling us that she is at a very important juncture in her life and in her career. In fact, it's quite striking to see it here in the graphic ephemeris, how it just literally comes and just touches her sun moon before changing direction. Now, in terms of transits on the at the time, okay, we also have transiting Jupiter sextile her natal Mars. And again here, this is an influence that's active during much of September, October, and is arguably waning in early, or separating in early November. But I think this is part of what's been giving her momentum in September and October. I think this Jupiter-Mars sextile was already coming into effect when, she by most people's most people's opinions, won that debate with Trump. Jupiter sextile Mars gives you confidence, and how again is for me one of the signatures of the person who wins in any contest rather. Also, in the shorter term, transiting Venus around the day of the election and the day or two after is opposing her ascendant and then slotting into her nodal axis. Now, this is not very weighty in itself, but it could perhaps describe a sense of celebration. There's something sort of joyous about that. It's just a small little indication that she's not looking too terribly miserable in the day or two after the actual election. If I could, go back just a step. I think it's also significant that she will be having transiting Jupiter passing through her first house, during much of 2025. And that in itself is indicating that what's in store for her in the months ahead is a sense of being a person who's recognized for, her virtues and her value, and that she has a platform through which to shine. Here again, it's so striking how these transits of Saturn and Jupiter just literally just touch these key places and change direction. This is transiting Jupiter, just touching that forming that sextile to her natal Mars, and then moving on. All right, now that Mars-Pluto opposition that Maurice mentioned, and that I think we've all noticed, is really quite a wild card factor. And we can't really know exactly how it's going to play out. With all of these high voltage emotions around this election, and the we've already seen attempted assassinations of Trump and so on. The idea that there could be some very dramatic event, maybe even violence breaking out somehow in the days before the election is real possibility. It strikes me though that this Mars Pluto opposition is literally forming 45-degree multiple aspects to her Pluto. Now, perhaps this is just giving her some fight in her or something like this. Perhaps it describes her being in some danger herself. I don't know if this is enough to actually indicate that she really is, likely to be assassinated or something that dramatic. But with Mars Pluto, with the Mars Pluto opposition in the heavens connecting with her Pluto, it's a little dangerous for her, I think. Now, transiting Neptune will be quincunx her sun and semisextile her moon. Now you see, I've circled Saturn here lightly, because what we actually what we have here would be a Saturn-Neptune Sun-Moon combination in the 24th harmonic. There's a 15-degree difference there between Saturn and Neptune. And this here, this combination of factors in her transits worries me a little. If there's anything that makes me concerned that she could experience a sense of disappointment, a sense of having her hopes dashed, something along those lines, this is for me what could describe that. Of all the factors against her winning, this is probably one of the strongest factors. Look, it could just be that transiting Neptune quincunx her sun could indicate being a bit overwhelmed, being exhausted. In Vedic astrology, you project houses from the sun and the moon like you do from the ascendant. So this would actually be Neptune in the 6th house from the sun. It could indicate just not feeling very well. It doesn't necessarily mean you lose the election, but it's not ideal. Now, in her secondary progress chart, the progressed sun is sextile Saturn 5 minutes from exact and applying. That to me is very striking. Now, I don't take sextiles and trines as necessarily good, like many people do, or squares and oppositions necessarily bad. When there are trines and sextiles to malefics, I'm less confident that it's definitely going to be a good thing. But that said, I believe there's an element of truth in the idea that sextiles and trines are a little bit more sort of gentle, at least, or supportive of things working constructively. And progressed Sun sextile Saturn, I would think, is exactly the kind of thing that would describe a person assuming responsibility. I was actually just before we went on here, I was reading what Alan Leo said in his book, The Progressed Horoscope, about progressed Sun sextile Pluto. And he very specifically refers to stepping into authority and having friends and allies, amongst very solid people, and there being a lot of honor and all of this sort of thing. Exactly, one would think a winning the presidential election would feel like or look like. So this is very strong. This is, for me, one of the factors that makes me think that she has a very good chance and is perhaps more likely to win. Now, this is her secondary progressed chart showing how the secondary progressed moon is forming a whole bunch of aspects. And this is very striking. The secondary progressed moon is sesquiquadrate progressed Saturn, sextile progressed Jupiter, sextile progressed and natal Pluto. And what you see, what we have here is progressed progressed Jupiter trine progressed Pluto. Okay, and remember that Pluto Jupiter signature is, in my view, one that indicates coming into power, stepping into power. And this progressed moon will, in the weeks, well, let's say the month or two following the election, that progressed moon is going to reach the midpoint of that Jupiter-Pluto trine. So we're going to have a progressed moon Jupiter-Pluto picture, within the months immediately after the election. This, for me, again, is one of the indications that she's actually stepping into quite a powerful phase, very soon in the months immediately ahead. Now, we've already looked at the secondary progressed Sun sextile Saturn, but when we look at her solar arc progressions, due to that very tight Sun-Moon opposition that she has in her natal chart, you get a solar arc progressed moon, also trine Saturn, right? So this in a sense reinforces the themes and indications of that progressed Sun sextile Saturn. So this and just thinking aloud here, I started off showing that the stationing, transiting Saturn, sesquiquadrate and semi-square her Sun-Moon opposition, and that's a little hard to decide, whether it's going to be beneficial or not. But perhaps these progressed influences connecting with Saturn in a positive way maybe tilts it in that more supportive direction in terms of her relationship with Saturn. Note that she was born with a Sun-Saturn trine. Okay, and people with Sun-Saturn trines, they become stronger as they get older. They blossom when they're older. It would make good sense to me that she might have been a relatively unassuming figure in an earlier part of her career and ultimately would reach high office. Now, again, looking at her solar arc progressions, the progressed ascendant is square Jupiter. To me, that's basically helpful. There's also solar arc progressed Saturn, sesquiquadrate Pluto. That maybe not so helpful. And, can indicate some sort of struggle, but, it's also the kind of thing that can make one really tough. If there are enough other indications are supportive in this context, of you succeeding, the Saturn-Pluto aspect in the solar arc picture, can simply indicate sort of a fortitude and a determination. Lastly, taking a little first glance look at what's happening in her Vedic astrology chart, she has Rahu conjunct her ascendant. And, in Vedic astrology, both nodes are considered malefic. But Rahu in particular is connected to materialistic things, materialistic power or worldly power. And particularly when it's in the first house, it often indicates people who are going to wield power in the world. Their lives might not be harmonious overall, but they tend to be successful on the material level. But conspicuously, she enters the Venus subperiod of this Rahu major period in February 2024, right through to February 2027. Now, what we'll see in a moment is that Trump also happens to be in the Venus subperiod of his major period, right? But in using very basic rules of Vedic astrology, we'd note here that Venus is a friend of the ascendant Lord Mercury. Okay, and just on that basis alone, it looks okay. It's not fantastic, but it's okay, right? Okay, so let's see what's happening for Trump in 2024. Now, transiting Jupiter is pretty close to his sun on his nodal axis, closely opposite his moon, in his 10th house. This is probably the strongest factor in his favor. This is the factor that makes me uncomfortable betting against Trump. There are many other things I'm going to be sharing that I think indicate that he might not be winning, but this is the kind of thing that normally indicates success. Jupiter conjunct Sun is usually very, very helpful and very empowering. And Jupiter in the 10th house is often transiting Jupiter in the 10th house. I often describe it to clients as like a sort of a cherry on the cake of a career that has already got an established trajectory and momentum. And here again, we see how, just like with Kamala, these very significant transits just come and touch these key places and change direction. This is transiting Jupiter connecting with his Sun-Moon node axis. I mentioned earlier that when he won in 2016, Mars was quincunx's ascendant by regular tropical Placidus settings, close to the cusp of the 6th house. By other criteria, definitely in the 6th house. But this time, this transiting Mars is close to the 12th house cusp here. I take this as definitely a 12th house Mars. In fact, this very near exact semi-sextile from transiting Mars to his ascendant is something I interpret as Mars being in the epicenter, in fact, of the 12th house. And this, to me, suggests that there are powerful enemies that are working against him, and some of those enemies are working in a way that he is unaware of, or that he can't identify or put up any resistance to. He's being undermined in some hidden way. Is how I would interpret this. And so here you can see on the left is 2016, that Mars close to the 6th house cusp. Here, Mars in the 12th house cusp. This, to me, just looks like a significant coincidence. Mars being 180 degrees apart on these two significant election dates. And in Vedic astrology, Mars being in the 6th house is a place where you're far more likely to beat your enemies, right? So I feel he's a lot weaker this time around in terms of this particular pattern. Now, transiting Uranus has been conjunct his midheaven for a while. I'm sure we all know that when there was that first attempt on his life, transiting Mars was conjunct Uranus on his midheaven, and it just showed what a sort of a wild card element this Uranus on his midheaven is. And this is one of the factors that makes me feel that just about anything could happen here. Bear in mind, this recent eclipse on the 2nd of October was sesquiquadrate Uranus. and in my opinion has sort of triggered it. And, with eclipses, often the effects can happen significant some time before or after. So, and this is also, again, one of the reasons why I feel that despite him having that helpful Jupiter-Sun conjunction in his transits, this Uranus on his midheaven is just so unpredictable and volatile that, even at the very last minute, there could be completely unexpected event or turn. Comparable to that transiting Neptune that is quincunx Kamala's sun, that I felt undermined her, he has transiting Neptune quincunx his Mars. And I feel that this transiting Neptune quincunx his Mars is comparable to that transiting Mars in his 12th. In both cases, you've got this idea of some veiled attack or hidden enemy or some some antagonistic force that you can't identify that's working against you, that results in you being very demoralized. So I think this Neptune quincunx his Mars weakens him significantly. And there's a few other Neptune factors that are affecting him strongly that make me, feel that there could be people working against him, perhaps even within his own or among his own associates. Here's another one of these interesting ways Neptune is highlighted, literally the transiting node axis connecting with his Neptune. I'm not very sure how to interpret the transiting nodes. Some people perhaps are sure. There's lots of different ways people interpret the nodal axis. I've come to view the nodal axis as something that helps to bring energies into a more public and visible space. From that perspective, I wonder whether or not this describes some sort of public humiliation and or what I mentioned a moment ago, that amongst his associates, there could be people that he can't trust. In the cosmobiology school of thought views the nodal axis very much as the people you associate with or your group affiliations. So there's some element of sort of murkiness there in his sort of tribe. Now, here's an interesting set of factors. This is his secondary progress chart on the outside. And we see here that there's this progressed Venus is approaching a conjunction to progressed Jupiter, squaring his natal Venus. I forget the lady's name, but not too long ago, everybody was fussing about this young opinionated influencer he was hanging out with. I don't know if this is just a simple signature of that, but anyway, this combination of factors would seem positive for him. It seems that this indicates lots of friendship, lots of goodwill towards him. This could look like a celebration, So this is tricky, but looks like it relates more to his personal life and connections with friends and well-wishers. It doesn't necessarily mean he'll win. His secondary progressed Mars is semi-square his ascendant. Now, in my opinion, this could mean one of two things. Well, there's other possibilities, but two things that come to mind for me. One of them is that this could describe him being furious because if he loses, because he feels he's been cheated. Or if he wins, in my opinion, this could show him going on the warpath, getting revenge on his enemies, really wielding his power and authority very assertively, very aggressively. In fact, this is one of my worries for any possible Trump presidency. If he does win, I think he's going to cause a lot more trouble than he did last time.
We need to close, Richard.
All right. Okay.
Any
I'm
concluding?
okay. Very briefly, progressed moon also square his natal Pluto, another indication of really raw emotions, lots of anger. Progressed midheaven conjunct Pluto, very similar themes. This is why I'm talking about the likelihood of him really going on quite a rampage. Okay. And what one last one I was squeezing here. Solar arc progressed Saturn squaring Mercury to the degree and minute. It's hard to see somebody not feeling terribly bitter about something. And I'll tell you what, I'll 2 more slides. Solar arc progressed Neptune on his sun-moon axis. Another indication that even if he wins, I think he's going to be quite disempowered. I think he's going to feel like he's like in a bog. And I think it's one of the things that could cause him to react a little like a wounded animal. This is the final slide. I mentioned that he's also in the Venus sub-period, which started in September 2024. That Venus is Lord of the 10th in the 12th, right? Conjunct Saturn. The dispositor, the moon, is debilitated and conjunct the south node. Now, that is just one negative indication after the other. So if I had to just base my conclusions simply on the Vedic charts of these 2 candidates, Trump would clearly lose. It's not that clear cut, but overall, my feeling is Kamala is going to win.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
Richard.
for bearing with me.
And a lot of food for thought. And I think at least what I've observed is that indeed the astrology is very ambivalent. There are a lot of mixed messages, and it seems like there will be definitely an element of unexpected affecting this sequence of events. But very rich and very clear. Thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you, Maurice.
And Bill? You are muted.
And now I'm unmuted.
Right.
And oops. And let me just do a little rearranging here. Okay, thank you. Well, first, there will be an election if Trump survives the next assassination attempt. Right now, as you'll see, the eclipse was 45 degrees to his Mars, and Uranus squares that exactly tomorrow. So I think you're in a maximum danger period for Trump. And even after, should he get elected, even into the end of the year, and should he get elected, I don't think they're going to stop trying to remove him from whatever office, or remove him completely. And we must all keep our heads above Neptune at 0 Aries. And when I say that, the world points affect everyone. Neptune there is, you have to float above the sea of mis and disinformation. So first we were told, Joe Biden, who was obviously suffering physically, we were told that he's sharp as a tack, and suddenly he disappears from the scene. And then in comes Harris, and Harris is eminently qualified. It keeps changing and shifting all the time. So also Neptune is fraud, voter fraud. And, I'm right now in my home, just outside of Princeton, New Jersey. And the news here is very different from what you get overseas. And I talk to people in Europe and other parts of the world all the time, and they don't hear anything about that. So, but anyway, there is a precedent for a return to the White House. Stephen Grover Cleveland served as both the 22nd, 24th president of the USA from 1885 to 1889 and from 1893 to 1897. He won the popular vote in three presidential elections and is the only president to serve non-consecutive presidential terms. So this has happened before. And the second paragraph is rather telling. He angered both parties by cleaning up corruption, whether they were Republicans or Democrats. He used tariffs, and he did not fire any government employees who were doing their job well, even if they were Republicans. He was a Democrat. So yes, this has happened before. And next, I'll explain why I use the Trump 9:51 a.m. birth time. I think this is still up on my website under articles. There are four reasons, of which the fourth is the most important. First, Charles Jane was a master of rectification. He and his ABC group had rectified, I think, 3 or 4 or 5,000 charts by 1960. This is in his old In Search magazine. And I sat with him not only in his classes, but when he rectified charts. And he always said Mom was the best source. And that was where the 9:51 a.m. birth time comes from. Second, Lynn Palmer was Trump's astrologer in New York. She used this time, and she told other astrologers that I know. Third, I dined with Trump family members many times on business in London and Abu Dhabi. I think that was 2012, 13, 14, I think. And they confirmed the time because you know how it is when you're an astrologer sitting with a bunch of people, somebody says he's an astrologer and you have to talk. So, but the major reason is I rectified the chart. And if you put the pointer on the 90-degree dial on his ascendant, it's 30 degrees one way and 30 degrees the other way, converse and direct, to planets that would signify marriage, which is what he did when he was 30. And usually when you rectify a chart, you sit there, even the next day, you keep going back and forth between the charts. But this time, the later birth time just doesn't match. There are no solar arc hits for his marriage. So I've continued using the same 9:51 birth time all along, and that's what I used for this presentation. So that's, of course, what the chart looks like. Now, in the 2016 election, I didn't make a clear-cut forecast in Dell Horoscope because, frankly, I just didn't have time for various reasons. But I was on Larry Pesavento's Traders News Network, and I said Trump would win the chart because I looked at the progress chart on a 90-degree dial, and here you see the progress sun equals progress sun over here, obviously, and it equals midheaven Venus. Nothing could be so great for your popularity. It also equals descendant midheaven, Mercury Apollon, which would be many people receiving your message, and Pluto Apollon is from something small to something very big. So that was 2016. 2020, it was a tale of two eclipses. Matters commenced 1 week before an eclipse or on the day of the eclipse rarely work out as planned. Trump began his campaign on a June 20th, 2020 solar eclipse. So I think he began the campaign, I think it was out in the Midwest only hours before that eclipse. And I noted in 2016, I wrote in Dell Horoscope that the next election, the eclipse in December was opposite his sun, and eclipses usually have an effect of about 90 days in advance and as long as a year afterwards. So the December 23, 2020 eclipse at 23 Sagittarius 08 was opposite Trump's natal sun at 22 Gemini 53. That's an orb of 15 minutes. And the minute I saw that, the only thing that would top that or would save him would be somebody who had the same eclipse opposite their sun with no orb at all, which is pretty much impossible. So it was a tale of two eclipses. You get knocked down. It's like being knocked down on a soccer field when the eclipse is conjunct your sun, the way it was in Grover Cleveland's chart when he first ran for president, that propels you forward. Transiting Saturn elevated as a plus. This is an old study from the AFA bulletin. It is best when Saturn is rising to the midheaven, and it's in Trump's 8th, it's in Harris' 10th. That's not a big difference, but I just threw it in here because I just happened to reread it in an old AFA bulletin. Transits and progressions. Jupiter into Gemini. The minute Jupiter entered Gemini, and I understand it's a Vedic principle, which I haven't studied, that when a planet enters a sign, it affects the entire sign. You don't have to wait for a Jupiter to get up to your sun or another planet. Charges against him dissipated, and he escapes 2 assassination attempts. They now in New York, the appeals court, they don't even know if the conviction they got is going to stand because it is just so full of holes. And Jupiter has been conjunct his Uranus, which is 120 trine to his natal Jupiter, 0's node, and Vulcanus sun. Jupiter is conjunct Uranus, which is 120 to his natal Jupiter. I left out a bracket there. It is conjunct his node, conjunct Vulcanus, which is the Uranian planet, Sun conjunct Vulcanus, in a very powerful personality. John F. Kennedy had this. I think Marilyn Monroe had this. So that is his best asset. So I agree with our prior speaker. But his progressed Sun was contraparallel progressed Jupiter, August 12th, 2024. Charles Jane used to say that progressions of the sun are very important, and you leave an orb of about 9 months. So this is still pretty hot. So progressed sun, contraparallel, progressed Jupiter is not going to go away right away. And Neptune is right on his Vesta. Now, Eleanor Bach, who brought the asteroids into astrology, used to say Vesta has to do with security. It has to do with paper securities. Both Bernie Madoff and Charles Ponzi at Neptune Vesta, they were selling false Neptune securities Vesta. So it's got to do a lot to do with financial fraud. So that is uncertain security, but it could also be phony ballots because Neptune and Vesta were very powerful in the Jupiter-Saturn chart from 2020. And I think that has probably got a lot to do with voter fraud. So, but more importantly is his physical safety, which obviously is in jeopardy. Now here's the progress chart using this 953 birth time on a 90 in the 2024 election. And over here we have the progress sun, but over here we have midheaven Venus, which are 90 degrees apart. So of course in the 90, they look like they're conjunct. And then that is just passed in opposition to his sun. This looks a bit like the 2016 chart where he won. And I just wanted to throw in a word about Hillary's birth time, which is 8 p.m. And that was obtained from my old friend Joyce Levine up in Boston, who bought her book, went to her book signing, asked Hillary directly, when were you born? And she said 8 p.m. And a lot of people say they missed getting the election right in 2016 because they had the wrong birth time. And I've been working with that for 20 or 30 years and it works. So it's 8 p.m. for Hillary. Now here's Trump's solar arc on election day. This is a Uranian picture. Sun plus Cronus minus Zeus is assuming office or assuming a position of power. On election day, it's 5 fixed and 20 mutable. And it equals transit Jupiter. This is a big plus for him. In other words, that formula for election day, you pop it into his chart and you can see it is very favorable for his chart. Sun plus Cronus equals Zeus is the formula for the commander-in-chief, also for becoming president. So for him, this with Jupiter near his sun is very favorable. Now, as I said, will he survive? The September 17th lunar eclipse was equal to Pluto, and lunar eclipses usually have an effect plus or minus about 6 weeks, much weaker than solars. And the October 2 eclipse, which you see right here, is 45 degrees to Mars, while Uranus is 90 to natal Mars on the 6th, which is tomorrow. Point of maximum danger. Neptune, as I mentioned, on Vesta, security is weak. But the stationary retrograde Jupiter on the 9th is 0 conjunct Vulcanus, Sun node in Uranus. Now, a couple of Charles Jane stories. He said Jupiter acted like a great preservative. You could do something stupid, something foolish, and come out smelling like a rose or looking good if Jupiter was strong. And he liked to tell a story about his student who was driving in the icy roads just north of here during the winter. A deer ran out in front of her car. She hit the deer. The deer was killed. The car spun out of control. The car was wrecked. She ran up on property and damaged property. And Jupiter to her son, she walked away without a scratch. And about late 70s, my Mercury was very afflicted, and I came down with a very severe pneumonia. And Charles said that Jupiter to my son probably saved me. So you can do dumb things and make mistakes, and Jupiter will still save you. So Harris, Saturn, I think, is her biggest problem. Saturn is 180 to Uranus. It will be stationary directed on November 15 at 12 Pisces, so it's slow enough already. That station is 45 to her moon, 135 to her sun, 90 to Pallas, 180, I already mentioned Uranus. Saturn Uranus, I found, and now I've been doing, this is the 52nd year I'm doing astrology. When people have business problems or setbacks, I know it's Saturn Uranus. They are extremely incompatible. Her progressed sun is 105 degrees to Uranus, which is a Jandro aspect in the 24th harmonic. In other words, multiples of 15, which will tend to upset things. And a progressed midheaven equals Sun Zeus, which isn't bad, Juno Zeus, and Mars Vesta. And Mars Vesta, again, is a concern with security. It's fighting for your turf. It's more of a defensive position. Sun Zeus is more of an offensive one. So, and the solar arc midheaven equals Neptune, and the solar arc activates Mars, Hades, Pluto. And I say similar to Hillary's chart in 2016. I don't know if you remember, but right before the election, was the head of the FBI, I think it was James Comey. He came out and he said something like there may be additional charges against Hillary, or there was some shenanigans going on. Well, that's her Mars Pluto activated by solar arc. And I thought it was odd that if he is Democratic, that he would mention it that close to the election. As a general unwritten rule is you don't say things like that 60 to 90 days before an election. And her sun moon midpoint equals Hades. So the solar arcs on the 90-degree dial don't look very good. And if I put that chart, commander-in-chief, in her chart, it doesn't equal anything very positive. The solar eclipse on October 2nd equals Hades and Zeus, which I don't see as favorable. It's strong in the horoscope of Joseph Goebbels of the Nazi regime. And he said the key is to direct Zeus, people's hatred, which is Hades. So I don't see that as being very helpful. And I think Trump has the upper hand here as far as the planets go. And in 2020, I did not see how he could lose based on fundamentals. But the two eclipses said he would. So I'm trying to put everything that I think aside, as I'm sure we all are. But this is non-astrology. This is based on The Theory of Contrary Opinion by Humphrey Neal, which is a very short book. I think it's probably a free PDF download by this time. His work was very highly developed by my old pal, Paul McRae Montgomery of Newport News, Virginia, who is a bond analyst and fund manager. And Neal's opinion, which Paul proved out by researching 3,200 covers of Time magazine. Whenever there was something on the cover of Time magazine that was investment related, the odds were 4 and 5, 80%, that price or investment would go opposite to that which the cover of Time suggested within an average of 4 months. So that's 80% of the time, whatever you saw on the cover was going south on average about 4 months later. And when 3 Mile Island blew up, Paul, in his reports, featured a cover of Time magazine. Is this the end of utilities? Well, the utility index, the Dow Jones Utility Index, bottomed right in that week. And I could give you a whole mess of examples like that. But appearing on the cover of Time seemed to be particularly deadly. And Neal's theory was, by the time it gets to the cover of a magazine, the trend has probably already spent itself. And Montgomery added to that, if it's a financial, let's say a sharp drop on the stock market, if it's on the cover of People magazine or some non-financial publication, the effect is doubled or tripled, because that means even people who are not involved in financial matters hear about it. So there is Kamala on there's Vice President Harris on the cover of Time. And strike two is she's on the cover of Barron's, which is not a political magazine. And having your picture there is equivalent to having a financial story appear on the cover of People magazine or some non-financial magazine. So I think Trump will win. And my major concerns are, if we look at the inauguration day, you see Mars opposite the midheaven and you see Sun conjunct Pluto. That, to me, says they're still after him. And he's going to be very heavy about cleaning out the government. And then you have Mars, Zeus, midheaven, T-square. Well, Zeus is directed energy. It's missiles, it's projecting yourself, and it's right on the angles in Washington, Sun conjunct Pluto. So I think this fits more of what I would expect should he get elected. And the thing that I most fear is Lord Rothschild once said, "Give me control over a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." So one of the quickest ways to make anybody unpopular, is contract the money supply and let the economy fall apart. Saturn and Neptune are conjunct in January 2026, not 25, but 26, at 0 Aries, which affects the whole world and is a key point in the horoscope of the Federal Reserve, which has, I think, 2 or 3 points, the midheaven, the angle, the sun, are all at 0 of cardinal signs. So my fear is he gets elected, they create a deflation, which helps not, well, it's exactly what we need to get rid of all the debt, but this would be done solely to get him out of office. So that's an old Rothschild trick. So that is my opinion. I'll turn it back to Maurice.
Thank you, Bill. Very insightful, and of course, very intriguing to hear about the Uranian component, which I don't think many of us are familiar with, but that's your contribution here. And there was a question from Julia, whether there are female Uranian planets, or are they mostly male figures?
Well, that's a good question. Well, if Poseidon, if you consider Poseidon, I think Poseidon's male. No, I think they're all male, as far as I can see.
Okay.
It was just something I kind of, realized, going, oh, no, of course, none of them are named after any feminine archetype. So interesting.
Well, here you are, Julia, to show
Well, you're
the other
next, aren't
side.
you?
Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you,
that's
Bill.
what I'm standing for.
A different perspective, and it's great to hear, exactly that, diversity. So I'm going to be leading, let me get organized. Share slides. So some of you have heard me already share some of these insights. It's worth repeating in the context of this presentation. The important activations transit-wise, we have that first Mars-Pluto opposition just before Election Day on 29, Cancer Capricorn. Now, you know that 27 Cancer is Mars fall degree. 27 Capricorn is Mars exaltation degree, and the opposite is 27 Cancer. So it's a point of extreme vulnerability, and the opposition to Pluto adds to that. Now, when we say, a point of vulnerability for Mars, remember that the Ukraine war and the Russian offensive started back in 2022 with Mars at 27 Capricorn. So the exaltation degree of Mars doesn't mean it's all roses. It can actually intensify Mars's aggression. But it's worth noticing that these are very important Mars degrees, and there's a Mars-Pluto opposition. So we know already how volatile, and many, both Richard and Bill mentioned the vulnerability of assassination, which we already talked about in the part 1 back in January, that there is a risk of assassination. December 6th, Mars turns retrograde at 6 Leo, which happens to be the north node of the United States. Okay, so the north node of the United States is 6 Leo. Mars stations on that degree and retrogrades. Obviously, Leo has to do with leadership. And most presidents, statistically, there's a higher probability for a US president to have either Mars in Leo or Mars in Scorpio. You know, Biden had Mars in Scorpio, and Kamala has Mars in Leo, and Trump has Mars in Leo. So they're in that category. It's interesting, you know, all leaders today have Mars in Leo, it seems. Like Netanyahu is a Mars in Leo, and Sinwar, Hamas leaders, Mars in Leo. So everyone is going to be affected by this retrograde of Mars in Leo, but particularly the United States. So there's, you know, with this Mars turning retrograde in December between election day and inauguration, there may be a shift, which brings us to the reality that either there's something about the count, you know, that is not decided right away on election day. You know, usually, you know, by the next morning, who's the leading president, who is going to be president. Or again, there's some kind of rebellion, revolt, something challenging the results. Yeah. January 3rd, second Mars-Pluto opposition. Mars is now retrograde. Pluto now has moved to Aquarius, and they oppose at 1 degree, Leo Aquarius. January 15, Mars opposes the Sun. So during the Mars retrograde cycle, the peak of the retrograde is when the planet retrograde opposes the Sun. So this Mars is going to be at 26 Cancer, opposing the Sun at 26 Capricorn. Now, Mars, Sun, the Sun is the leader. Mars is again uprising, anger, some kind of defiance. Now, Kamala's full moon is at 27 Libra Aries. So the Mars retrograde peak squares Kamala's natal full moon. So I'm showing it here. You know, her full moon is going to be repeatedly squared by the Mars-Pluto, and then it's going to be squared in that kind of cardinal grand cross as the Mars opposes the Sun mid-January. So all this happens before the inauguration on the January 20th. Later, Mars turns direct at 17 Cancer. Third Mars-Pluto opposition in April. And then June, we have the first Saturn-Neptune conjunction at 1 Aries. It's, you know, they're not going to be conjunct exactly. They're going to be half a degree apart, but we're going to feel that anyway. So another interesting reality is that we are currently under a Saturn-Jupiter square, a first opening square. So usually Saturn-Jupiter cycles represent cycles of leadership, legalities, whoever is going to be the teacher, whoever is going to be, the role model. So, Saturn, Jupiter both have to do with the rule of law, with law and order, but also with teachers, leaders, governance. The United States, it was, based on the Sibley chart, also born on a Jupiter-Saturn square, this time a closing square. Now we're in an opening square. You see here the United States North Node at 6 degrees Leo. So Mars going to retrograde there, just a reminder. And all these Mars-Pluto opposition are going to be on the natal Pluto. So interestingly, both Trump and Kamala are born different years, but under a Saturn-Jupiter opening square. Different signs, different houses, same aspect. So it's interesting that these two figures come to the forefront of our consciousness, and we're talking about them over and over and over again, to nauseating extent. But part of it is that they represent that aspect. And what is that aspect but a need to kind of bring change to leadership? The square brings a necessary tension, and both of them are proponent for a change. Trump is one who wants to reverse a lot of existing agreements and the tariffs, and reverse environmental laws. He wants to drill and is not concerned about the environment as much at all, and focuses on economic policies. Kamala brings her brand of change, which is social, which is obviously in her being a person of color, first woman in such a position of power, after Hillary, a strong candidate. Whether she wins or not, she's a strong female leader in the American consciousness. These are just quick graphics about the Mars-Pluto opposition, November 3rd, January 3rd, April 26th. Now, consider that Mars is not only on these critical degrees, but it's also the ruler of the North Node until the nodes shift to Pisces, and that's going to be in January. Yes, indeed, 1946 and 1964 are the same numbers reversed. So the Mars retrograde peak, here you see it. Not only is it going to be an opposition, which is very vulnerable for leaders around the world. This is not just for the United States. It could affect leadership in different countries. But because Kamala's cardinal axis is exactly perpendicular, and Trump's Saturn is 25 Cancer. So both of them, are on the spot here. The sun will then move on to Pluto. So we have a sun Mars and then a sun Pluto, which obviously doesn't inspire stability. I mentioned that the day of the election things seems to be uncertain. And it seems like the day after November 7, when the moon actually starts to conjunct Pluto, it's in Capricorn the whole day, then it conjuncts Pluto opposing Mars. That's going to be some kind of decisive blow up, some kind of tension about what's going on with the election. Now, I want to bring not just the transits of this period, but to look at, Bill brought it up, the Neptune and Saturn entering Aries. There's a major shift of planets that is starting in 2025 and continuing in the following years. So Saturn, Neptune move from water, Pisces, to fire, Aries. Pluto has moved from Earth, Capricorn, to air, Aquarius. Uranus is about to move into air, Gemini, and Jupiter by June will also move to the cardinal degree of Cancer. So you have these very cardinal activations on the, these seeding points, zero cardinal. And if we look where this lands, this Saturn-Neptune conjunction, it lands in Kamala's 10th house. It doesn't make an immediate aspect, but a quincunx to her Mercury. But it is in her 10th house. I'm going to look at solar arcs later. In Trump's chart, it lands in his 8th house. And it will very soon after, Saturn will oppose Neptune. So whether Trump is elected or not, having this conjunction in his 8th house and then oppose Neptune is an extremely humbling aspect. You will see throughout the course of history, all the presidents who were impeached, Bill Clinton, or falling from grace, like Dominique Strauss-Kahn, or, exposed for corruption, like Benjamin Netanyahu. They all experienced this extreme humbling and fall from grace when Saturn and Neptune were in opposition. It's one of the hardest aspects a politician and someone in power can experience, unless they have an impeccable record and there's nothing, no dirt, no scandal possible. But otherwise, it is treacherous. It's really difficult. And so this happens later in 2025, which can mean that the prosecution issues will continue and this time, be more severe. It could also reflect some health issues. Now, if we look at Trump, this ongoing Uranus square Mars is not only the risk of rebellion and assassination and people, not liking him, but it's also the risk of strokes. Mars in Leo has to do with cardiovascular health. Uranus has to do with nervous, brain function. And so this ongoing square is not only a political matter, it's also a physical and practical health risk. So along, he's been under incredible stress, not just campaigning nonstop, but facing life-threatening situations, which obviously adds to the fact that he's not, leading a healthy lifestyle and eating healthy. So he's under a lot of duress during and after this election. So looking at Kamala's transit for the election, excuse me, Neptune is on top of the chart. Pluto, Mars, we mentioned, squares her full moon. And the day of the election, Neptune, the sun is about to conjunct her Neptune. Now, some of you may be familiar with my work on Neptune. I am advocating the fact that Neptune is prominent, necessary, along with 12th house position for any political office. Biden was elected for Senate when he was 30, with Neptune on his ascendant. He was elected with Obama in 2008 when Neptune squared his sun. He was elected in 2020 when Neptune was on his IC. So Neptune and his packed 12th house are instrumental in public office, because Neptune has to do with global service. It has to do with the sacrifice of your personal life to serve a larger cause. So when you are a politician of that caliber, you sacrifice your personal life for a larger cause, and that is a 12th house Neptune reality. So the fact that the sun is on her Neptune is actually supportive of her, leadership. Especially in the 5th house. I'm using Koch houses. So here Neptune is in the 5th, it's swinging between the 6th and the 5th. But given that she is, someone who is a, presidential nominee, it makes sense that Neptune's in the 5th. Solar arcs, I think both Richard and Bill mentioned solar arcs, and Richard mentioned the 28 degrees of her solar arc sun being sextile Saturn. It happens to be the midpoint of her sun Saturn. So it's definitely a very critical degree, and sun Saturn is leadership. Now, we can say, well, does that reflect the fact that she became the nominee, that Biden stepped down and she became the savior? She rose to prominence and everybody loves her. Is that enough of an indication for her to embody that Sun Saturn midpoint? Or is she actually becoming, the president? It's hard for us to say, because she already ascended to a leadership position. To what extent, astrology cannot be, as far as I know, cannot be that decisive. But there's another very important component in Kamala Harris's directions, solar arc, is that she is 60 years old. And that means that the whole chart has moved 60 degrees from the natal, which means that all the solar arc positions are sextiling the natal position. So Mars is 21 Libra, sextile natal Mars at 21 Leo, and and so forth. Saturn, sextile Saturn, Sun, sextile Sun, Neptune, sextile Neptune. So she's in that pivotal time. Usually when someone is going through the solar arc 30 degrees to the natal or 60 degrees to the natal, these are life-changing years. So it becomes one of the most pivotal year for the individual, which adds to her momentum and to the fact that it had to be now. And now, obviously, it's clear that it's after the fact that we know that Biden stepped down, but it is indeed, giving her presence in this alignment. Looking at Trump, the transit, definitely Jupiter on the North Node is a strong suit, and it does show that that there's a lot happening for him. So it's, I remember exactly what Bill was saying, that the moment Jupiter moved into Gemini, a lot of the court cases dissipated. Like the Gemini energy really fanned, his flames and his appeal. But at the same time, it also brought a lot of the, we can argue the hostilities. He was saved from the bullets, but somebody tried to kill him. So, there's bad luck and there's good luck. It's like a mixed bag. Jupiter is now going to be retrograding. It's not a direct Jupiter moving into his North Node and onto his Sun. Jupiter is now backtracking. And so it may not have as much momentum as when it first moved into Gemini. Retrograde planet tend to bring more doubt and more reflection, but it's still a very, very prominent place. And this, this is what makes this election a little bit ambivalent. There are no absolutely clear signatures to me that says, oh, this is the one or that's the other. It's interesting that when we look at Jupiter on the North Node for Trump, guess what? It's also on the North Node for Kamala and on her ascendant. So they have the same nodes. They don't only share the full moon, they also share their same nodes. And so there's definitely a mirroring quality for both of them. For Trump, it's in the 10th house. For Kamala, it's in the 1st house. So both of them are angular houses. And as I said, don't underestimate the 12th house. It is a house of service and of public notoriety. So, back to Trump. The moon is going to be in Capricorn during the end of the election day, the voting time, which is a strong position for him. 5th house is related to leadership, so that moon can give him assurance that he is in good standing. So that's a strong point for him. Other factors, we mentioned Uranus on the MC, which is both the wild card, but also the health risk and the instability. Uranus on, Trump is a Sun Uranus born. So, he's a contrarian. He wants to bring new ideas, but he's often antagonizing everyone around him. During his administration, there were a record of people resigning from his administration. Like there was such a turnover because, he was difficult to work with. So Uranus on the MC here can again bring a lot of the rebellion into play. Looking at his secondary progression, I think Richard already mentioned it's not favorable. The moon is in Scorpio, just about to square Pluto. Now, a moon in Scorpio is prone to feelings of rejection. On top of it, square Pluto in the 12th house. Here, there's definitely issues about abandonment and fear of rejection. So that is not a strong progress moon for him. However, and also Mars is going to be on his Chiron and Juno, which, Mars Chiron by transit has unfortunately been associated with assassinations. Martin Luther King had a Mars Chiron when he was assassinated. Che Guevara had a Mars Chiron when he was eliminated. So this amplifies the risk for his safety. But it can also mean that he is, Mars Chiron can also, be a humbling experience. It doesn't have to be fatal. And, we definitely have to pray for safety for everyone and the candidates, because it's, with all the emotions, it is going to spin things out of control beyond the pain and the grief. Looking at the the running mates, interestingly, Tim Walz, which is the running mate for Kamala, has the North Node on his Mars. He's natally has a Mars square his nodes. Now that Mars, makes him a fighter, makes him the football coach, and kind of the want to get things done, ready for campaigning, very enthusiastic. So it can give him momentum, and it can be a positive sign in the context of these elections. But Mars is also tantrums. It can also show that there is some friction or some disputes. It can reflect a climate of defense. Vance's chart, the Mars-Pluto opposition is going to square his Pluto in the 3rd house. So I'm not sure what to make out of the 3rd house in this context, but the Mars-Pluto in the 12th, right on the cusp of his 6-12, which are houses of leadership, 12th house of hidden enemies, definitely speak of serious challenges. So it doesn't look like elections are so favorable. If Mars was to conjunct his sun, it would have been a positive, I'm going to get my leadership. I'm going to shine my Leonian energy. But Mars is going to stop short of the conjunction to his sun at 6 degrees Leo and then retrograde. He's also a Sun-Saturn square. definitely daddy issues, which happen to land on, Trump's Pluto. So Vance's Sun Saturn square is on Trump's Pluto. And they also have a Mars square. So they know each other from some kind of past life. And we can see why Vance initially hated Trump and spoke badly about him when you look at these aspects. There's probably a past life of fatherhood gone wrong and betrayal, which is kind of being reconfigured this time. So in his advantage, he's also having the moon in his 5th house. They have the same ascendant as Trump, and the same Uranus, prominent in the 10th house. So there are definitely strong points for both of them. Now, I just looked at the moons and the sun. The moon on election days in Capricorn, and both spouses of the candidates have moons in Capricorn. Inauguration day, the moon's going to be in Libra. Both Kamala and hubby are Libras. Trump's Jupiter is in Libra, and Vance's moon is in Libra. So there's no clear sway in saying, oh, that moon favors one camp over another. It seems evenly distributed. So all this to share, what we're heading into. I'm, again, not making a clear distinction and choice about who is going to be the winner, because astrology doesn't seem to be so decisive. But based on this chart for the solar arc, for Kamala Harris, having her 60-degree angles, and Trump's poor secondary progression, I tend to favor Kamala Harris with an edge astrologically. So thank you. And if you're interested in understanding the Neptune placements in mundane astrology and in public service, check out this book. And I'm passing the mic now to Julia.
Thanks, Maurice. I just want to kind of connect you to what you just said about Kamala Harris's chart with the 28 Sagittarius solar arc sun being the midpoint of Saturn and what was it? Jupiter, right?
No, Saturn, Sun.
Oh, Saturn, Sun. So that is also the midpoint. That is opposite or on the dial to 20 degrees of mutable, which is exactly where Jupiter is now and stationing, and also will be, we're on election day at 20 degrees. So that's very interesting for, adding to that. So when you find a midpoint that's most obvious, there's also an opposite point, on the dial where you can see these kind of things. So anyway, I've just started working with all that a lot more, because to me, it fits in more of the story, if you know what I mean.
Let's hear it.
Yeah, so yes, so again, fits in more of the story that we don't obviously see with just using, without using midpoints, really. So anyway, a lot of you know who I am, so thank you for being here. A lot of familiar names there. I love to see, and it's great to see always new names and people involved. So yes, just a little bit about the CIA. We have a magazine, we have a subscription, we're on social media, so follow us to all those places. And that's, of course, my main sort of area of working and so on. And you can get in touch with me from there. I was just going to add, I've done a talk just recently for NCGR, a 2-hour session on using geodetic maps and mundane astrology. So a little bit of this is what I did there. So for anyone that's interested in a bigger version of, let's say, extrapolating parts of what I talk about today, please go to NCGR San Francisco for the recording. So, and I'll also be doing a talk for the CIA on using maps, astrocartography, geodetic and local space, but for personal charts for the CIA on the 15th of November. Okay, so keep in touch and subscribe to the CIA newsletter and email so that you will get updates for all of that. So, look, what I want to start with is, again, in mundane astrology, a lot of, focus is put onto the Aries ingress in regard to a, particular theme for the year ahead and so on. And, if we remember the Aries ingress that just happened, of 2024, some really, two or a few things really stand out. And one of them is, of course, Mars on the IC for Washington, D.C. at 27 degrees Aquarius, which is the USA moon. And as we'll see later, it's Kamala's Saturn and Donald Trump's part of fortune. So it's kind of like everywhere we look, they're both sort of represented. And as it's been mentioned before, they have so many kind of similarities as well, 18 years apart, both with strong Gemini signatures, having a Jupiter transit, Mars in Leo, there's a few things here, and we'll see more of that as I do this. The other thing we see for Washington, D.C. is that the moon is, the most elevated planet at the time, and it's also out of bounds. And it reminds us that we are living in this time during 2024 and 2025 in these extremes, as we call the lunar major standstill, where the moon is going furthest out of bounds that it ever does. And especially in this 6-month period, right? From the solstice, I think that we had in July to the Capricorn solstice, that's the most extreme. So we are in this period of time that really represents the extremes, right? And so to keep that in mind, as we go on, Uranus and Jupiter are on the descendant. So, I think that's all very much about new energy, a revival of some kind coming through, something different, something that hasn't been presented before. Leo, the moon in Leo, out of bounds, is opposite Pluto in Aquarius. And of course, for 248 years, we haven't had Pluto in Aquarius. And so I think that's also a representative of something very new, not tried before, hadn't been done before. And Venus is conjunct Saturn in Pisces in the 4th house. We have the nodal axis squared by Ceres and opposite the part of fortune. Of course, the part of fortune is just all about location, so it's specific to Washington, D.C. And so I see this Ceres as a very big indicator, as we looked at the Aries ingress, months ago, that she was going to be very dynamic in 2024, and mostly because she spends most of the year out of bounds. Like, she's not out of bounds in this particular Aries ingress, but she will be during the election and sort of in and out, but most of the time very, very much out of bounds. And it's not unusual for her to be that way, but she wasn't, let's say, for the 2020 election or the 2016 election, but she will be this time. And then she's also making a 45-degree aspect to Mars at 28 fixed. So these are really sort of strong players in the year ahead. And maybe we could almost look at one of them representing the female runner and the other one, the male. But, that's just kind of symbolic, let's say. And Ceres is also the midpoint of Saturn and Jupiter, which falls at 13 degrees of Aries. So here we are, you know, that is very much on the node. So it's a very decisive time for the USA. And I think that also, you know, by a few of the things that I've said, are very indicative of a new way forward, not repeating something we've already seen, which is obviously that Trump has already had his time as president, right? And so what I've also learnt to look at very strongly is, of course, the astrocartography maps. In this case, we can see that Mars on the IC there. We can see, you know, Mars and Pluto kind of going, Pluto and the moon going right through the middle of the USA at the time of the Aries ingress. But that's not really what I'm most concerned about, because I'm going to sort of move into more about the geodetic charts, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So I've just got the Aries ingress chart on the outside for Kamala Harris. And as we can see, we've got Mars on her Saturn. Now, again, Saturn can represent restrictions, but here we've got what do you call it, Mars coming through for her in a sense of, you know, confirming something, perhaps taking it away. I mean, again, we're not really sure. We've got the Jupiter-Uranus, or Uranus heading for her Jupiter. Again, a change in something to do with her life, or an upgrade. Uranus usually indicates those kind of things. And again, we know Jupiter's coming that way as well. And we've got all of these planets in the 10th house during the time of the Aries ingress for her. And the MC for the Aries ingress is near her Mars. And the ascendant of the Aries ingress is on her Neptune. Okay, so, you know, just a few things to consider. And also that the natal Venus, her natal Venus is at the midpoint of Pluto and the moon. Again, not very obvious to see, but the midpoint of the Pluto and the moon is 2 degrees of Scorpio. Now, of course, that is where her Mercury is. And it's also 45 degrees to her Venus, meaning that is setting off all those midpoints. So, you know, here we are, we've got her very much engaged with that Pluto moon. It's a very dynamic, let's say, indicator or symbol, astrological symbol of a powerful feminine force perhaps coming in. That's how I'd see it. Again, it's very volatile. It's very much playing out on the world scene in regard to people protecting their lands and, you know, fighting and full force out there. And the ingress MC for the USA or for Washington is sextile her node and her ascendant. So we've got a few, you know, kind of cool indicators there that, and a Ceres return, although it's a bit past, she is having a Ceres return coming closer to that during the year. And again, that's, you know, quite a big thing as well. Now, what have I got up here? The Aries. Oh, I've already done that. I don't know why it's showing it twice. Sorry. Sorry. Now, yes, Mr. Trump. And of course, we've seen Maurice and Richard have talked about his chart, of course. And at the Aries ingress, we've got Uranus and Jupiter coming over his MC. We have the MC of the USA ingress conjunct his Mars. We have the nodal axis conjunct his Jupiter and Chiron. And we have Mars on his descendant as well, conjunct his part of fortune. So, you know, there's quite a few things going on for him as well. And the Moon Pluto midpoint at 1 Scorpio, I've written 1 Scorpio, that's 1, 2, it's not so, it doesn't really matter, is actually 45 degrees from his Uranus. So, again, he's activated by this ingress, of course, and running for the show. And yes, his future transits, we will see Jupiter, as we've seen in the other speakers' charts, that Jupiter's coming over his Sun and North Node. Uranus remains in the 10th house, squaring Mars. And the nodal, the Sun stations conjunct yes, sorry, and Jupiter stationing there as well, as I sort of mentioned before, is really also very significant and will be retrograde there for the election date. The nodal axis is actually conjunct Neptune at the election, so it's moving backwards over his second house. But what I want to focus on, much more, this is just kind of an introduction. It's like who is really sort of set into or kind of fixed into, let's say, the psyche of the USA at this time through the symbolic map of the geodetic map, as we call it. And the geodetic map is a map that we use to put any sort of astrological chart or transits onto, progressions, whatever you like, onto the world map, but not like an ACG map, but as in starting from 0 Greenwich, right? So that, we have Neptune and Saturn meeting there, coming up next year and into 2026. And, that's a focal point very much about big world and global changes. But if we slot into, as we go across, Aries rules, Aries is on the midheaven, the first 30 degrees, the next 30 degrees is Taurus, and so on. And then we have rising and setting signs from those cardinal points. And if we focus on one particular area, and, I got very interested in this when I realized, Canberra for Australia has, a Leo MC and a Sagittarius rising, and then noted that, our most popular Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, had very strong Leo and Sagittarius signatures. And so I've sort of started looking at that with kind of world leadership around, around the globe. And what we wanted, so every area on the planet has a, an MC particular sign and a rising degree called the geodetic equivalent, right? So that, every city, every town will have its own GE coordinates. And so for the area of Washington, DC, we've got Capricorn on the MC, Cancer on the IC, Aries rising, and Libra descending. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go forward. And so therefore, the exact coordinates for Washington, DC are 23 degrees Aries rising and Libra descending, of course, the opposite. And then 14 degrees Capricorn MC and 14 degrees Cancer IC. Now, of course, what you already know is that the USA Sun is 14 degrees of Cancer. So on the IC, many people have, said before that, of course, that's why, Washington was built or as the capital in that place. And I know there's a lot more connected to that. And in the USA chart as well, Saturn is at 14 degrees of Libra. So anything that is in the cardinal, let's say, squares to Aries and Libra, we're also looking at Capricorn and Cancer. So 23 degrees of Aries, Libra, Capricorn, Cancer, and also 14 degrees Capricorn, Cancer, Libra, Aries are very dynamically engaged with this area. Now, of course, what have we got happening at the moment or at the Aries ingress? We've got Ceres at 13 of Capricorn and in and out of that area most of the year. And Eris also crossing for Washington, DC at the Aries ingress. So here we can see that happening here. We've got Ceres on the MC and Eris rising. And I won't go into any more of that because there's too much to get into. And that's just a close-up of that. So here we have Eris and Ceres going through Washington at the Aries ingress. Now, Eris is, of course, a planet and a newly discovered one that sort of changed the hierarchy of everything and also, let's say, promoted Ceres, the dwarf planet to be, let's say, equalized to Pluto. Some wouldn't say that, but you know, we do need more feminine sort of representation in our astrology for sure. And so here we have Eris, a wild card going through, you know, the geodetic coordinate here with Ceres crossing. Now, that explains, of course, the craziness of the year that it is at the moment as well, and that anything could happen, the wildness of all of that. But I think Ceres coming across there is very indicative of perhaps, you know, something, you know, America is going to vote for what it needs the most. Of course, that's, you know, that's sort of obvious, but maybe more in a tame way. So if we just remember that Chiron is also heading this way, it's at the moment it's 22 degrees, so it's very much over that point. And here we see the ACG, what we'd see on the ACG map, but translated to the geodetic map, if that makes sense. So for some of you, this may be new, but again, it's so very symbolic of what's going on, and that's how I look at it. And if we go down the line, so the Cancer ingress, the ingresses we always look to let's say what's changing every season or every 3 months. We can see that Chiron is there now with Eris, and Ceres is now at a midpoint of Venus and Pluto, which is interesting. And Ceres is, of course, around 17 degrees now, retrograde, so she's still hovering in the area. And here we can see that on the map. And just before we look at the Libra ingress, because that's ruling this next sort of 3 months and what the election time is, let's look back at the Libra ingress of 2016 when Donald Trump was elected, you know, running against Hillary Clinton. And we had Eris. Eris moves very slowly, so she's still in the area, very unstable time, we could say, for the USA. But it was conjunct exactly Uranus. So, you know, for Donald Trump to win with Uranus going through that area is, you know, kind of makes a lot of sense because he's like a wild card. He's very Uranian representation. You don't know what he's going to do next, what he's going to say, you know, how kind of crazy and nuts he is anyway. So to me, that sort of showed this very much, this energy, this Uranian energy coming in. And then the Libra ingress for 2020, when Joe Biden was elected, we had the stability of very much Pluto, well, stability, but a serious kind of instability at the same time, with Pluto and Saturn very much involved or close to the MC there, but meaning also crossing those geodetic coordinates, right? Remember, 23 degrees Aries is squaring this. So that's the rising point of this USA part. We had Mars rising through there, very much, you know, on the Aries point or Aries degrees, and Mercury opposite. And of course, we know what happened and what happened at the Capitol afterwards and so on. But again, we can see that that was very dynamically, let's say, engaged there. And if we remember, Saturn at 25, Capricorn, and Pluto were opposite Trump's, what is it, Venus and Saturn as well. Yeah, there we go. And of course, if we remember also, Kamala was elected as the VP at that time, right? Now, this is a Libra ingress that we've just had, and we've got, now we can see Chiron and Eris very much, let's say, playing out and very visible and very, let's say, present during the election time, okay? So actually, Washington, D.C. is kind of right in the middle of Chiron and Eris. And I'm thinking, well, you know, what does Chiron mean? Yes, you know, okay, a healing sort of energy coming through, or a more disruptive one, you know, both together, that's a lot to deal with as well. Just also on the world stage, but again, very much focused on the ascendant of the USA, right? And then we also have at the Libra ingress, we've got 21 degrees of Libra rising. So therefore, it's also very engaged with, what's coming up. Ceres is out of bounds on the MC. Again, very close, or not exactly on top of the 13 Capricorn, but now she's out of bounds. And Chiron is the ascendant on the descendant. So we could look at this as though who's bringing in the most of the kind of healing energy, or the Erisian energy, or the wild card that we haven't had before. This is, again, Eris was very much with Uranus at the time of 2016, but now we have Chiron. So again, which of those would we be seeing to kind of represent that? And just a little bit of an aside, what we saw just recently happen with the eclipse that happened at 10 degrees of Libra was very much involved with the Libra ingress Mars and the Ceres. And of course, we've got that incredible destruction that just happened with Hurricane Helene. And I just wanted to point out that this is now the eclipse lines on the geodetic map with Mercury. We know that Mercury was there, Black Moon Lilith, Makemake, the Easter Island god, which the eclipse went over, and the eclipse 10 degrees of cardinal rises right through that area. So with geodetic maps, we kind of keep seeing these kind, as the more I look, the more kind of representative they are of hotspots on the planet. And it seems a little bit bizarre because it's not an ACG map, it's a fixed map. But again, the more you look at it, the more you see. And there was an asteroid, Helena, which was also at 7 degrees of Libra. So that's also quite over the top. And here we have 15 Cancer. What we know is the IC of the USA geodetics, right? Or Washington. And we've got Ceres up on the midheaven as well. So causing havoc. Now, and also, of course, there was a grand trine happening in the water signs, and a eclipse in conjunct Neptune 2 weeks prior. So many kind of, let's say, indicators of what we saw happen. Now, remembering the geodetic coordinates of Washington, D.C., let's just look, I've just put this together of past presidents and maybe more of the popular presidents like JFK, whose astrology chart or natal astrology chart was so connected to it. He had his nodal axis at 12 degrees of cardinal signs. He had his ascendant and descendant at 20 degrees of Libra, so very much connected to the ascendant and descendant. And he had 23 Capricorn and Cancer on his MC and IC. So just an example. I probably haven't got time to read out all of these, but we can see Obama was very much connected with Saturn at 25 degrees Capricorn. His nodal axis was also 28 fixed. Now again, with a midpoint to 13 degrees of Capricorn, very much slotted into the dynamics of a president and that place, the White House. We've got Donald Trump, which I'll look at a little bit more in a minute. So he has got, also connections there. Hillary Clinton had connections there. Of course, she was also a first lady in the 80s, but her relocated chart to Washington, D.C. gives us a few more indicators. And then a few other presidents I've only got a bit to, but, we can see that they're all got that dynamic going on. All right. So here we have Kamala's chart, and what I have got is her natal chart on the left and her relocated chart to Washington, D.C. She's obviously been living there for a while and being elected from there, let's say, or for there. And what we can see is that her sun and moon are in the cardinal degree, not exactly on, 23 degrees or 23 degrees of cardinal, but very close. And then when we relocate her chart, and I think this is really important, and maybe a lot of people forget to do this for someone that's been living somewhere for a while, or again, I think it makes sense now. So her sun and moon move to the 4th and 10th house, and the moon very close to the ascent, to the MC there. And she has a 3 degrees of Leo rising, and she has a 21 degrees or 22 degrees Aries MC in Washington, really kicking off those coordinates I've just shown you. Mars is in the 1st house, ruler of the 1st house. Sorry, not ruler of the 1st house, ruler of the MC in Washington, D.C. and in trine. And we can kind of, let's say, foresee that Mars stations very close to that ascendant, and retrogrades over and back into her 12th house from there. So I keep forgetting to put my markers on, and her ascendant there, yes, 3 Leo. Then we put her onto the USA independence chart, and some striking things kind of come up. Is Pallas Athena, is exact, her natal Pallas Athena is conjunct the USA ascendant of the Sibley chart, and I know other astrologers use other charts. Ceres is opposite Jupiter and Venus, and the nodal axis is conjunct Mars. Uh-oh, someone's ringing me. Sorry, I don't know where that's coming from. It will go away. Oh, hang on, here it is. Sorry. Oops. It's Kamala ringing. Sorry, I turned it off.
We can't hear it.
Oh, good. Oh, thanks. Okay, so where am I? So Saturn in Aquarius is conjunct the moon, okay, which is very cool, and the Pallas Athena of the USA. The moon and sun are opposite and sextile the moon, so we've got these combinations here. Oops, sorry. And the Mars retrograde station, as I think Maurice said, will be on the USA nodal axis as well. So that, there's a lot going on there, and very dynamically connected to, let's say, the USA chart. Okay. Oops. Sorry, that just really put me off there. So I've talked about, and she's got her Ceres. Her Ceres is out of bounds and opposite the USA Venus and Jupiter. So I think very, very connected to, as we understand, Ceres is the goddess that provides what is most needed and nurtures what is most needed. And perhaps that is what's most needed for the USA right now. So sorry. Now, something interesting I looked at was the first ever elected female prime minister. And she was elected for Sri Lanka back in 1960, and then also became president in 1994. After her, there was many other female prime ministers and presidents, but she was the first one. And I just find it very interesting that we've got Kamala's moon and sun there, very much dynamically connected to a Libra sun and a Libra moon. And also for Sirimavo's ascendant, we have Kamala's, outer planets, Pluto and Uranus, and also Venus. That's just something to kind of think about. And also this female president, Sirimavo, for the geodetic coordinates of Colombo, I find this again all the time, is 20 degrees of Gemini is the MC, which is her MC, and 20 degrees of Virgo is her is the ascendant of Colombo, and that's very close to her ascendant as well. Anyway, so maybe more of us will start looking at these things. Now, Kamala's solar return at her home place shows Venus rising in Sagittarius. Now, of course, remember in Washington, D.C., her chart becomes 3 degrees of Leo rising. And then when we see the solar return in Washington, we have Ceres rising. We got Mars in the 7th house. And we've got the node trining the US node. And again, so the solar return, places the timing of, that year into what can kind of, let's say, connect more up together, right? And again, these coordinates are very much in regard to what I talked about, the GE coordinates of the MC of the USA. Ceres is out of bounds as well. And we have an angular Mars, an angular Ceres, and an angular Mars as well. Mars will be the same degree as Inauguration Day as well. And Ceres is out of bounds. I'm nearly finished. I'm not going to get to Trump. But anyway, so Richard just reminded us that Kamala's progressed moon is at 14 degrees of Cancer. So on the IC of those geodetic coordinates. And then this is the solar arc. Her solar arc is now Jupiter progressed to be very much connected to that Aries ascendant as well. So this is the election day. I've just put it for midday that day. I think one of the most important things that we see here again that shows us pushing the envelope, or let's say the voters pushing the envelope to something that hasn't been experienced before, being a first female Black president, is the moon, Ceres, and Venus are all out of bounds on that day. We can see the black moon Lilith, that's at 2 Scorpio, right on her Mercury. And remember that Pluto moon midpoint that we saw in the Aries ingress chart. Uranus applies to Jupiter, or it's going back to Jupiter. It's moved past, but it's retrograde and going back. And then we've got the Eris and Chiron on the MC, sort of making that much more obvious. So yeah, so these are like the indicators. And then also Pallas Athena and Venus are also triggering her south node. Now, just one thing to remember about Venus, in 2016, Venus was in the same place in Sagittarius around Trump's south node as well. And she was also out of bounds in 2016 as well. But we didn't have the moon, and we didn't have Ceres out of bound back then as well to maybe let Hillary get through. But I think this is some really kind of big indicators here that we will be seeing Kamala kind of pushing through as she's got the right connections going on. And many of you done, again, Donald Trump's chart. He doesn't, and I have done it, but he doesn't have as many indicators like this. He has some, but it's almost like Kamala's just kind of keep stacking up, the more things that you look at, whereas his kind of don't have as much kind of connection. And then, of course, yes, it's her return of 60 years old wood dragon. There is the word calling her lotus, which I think is funny with her South Indian heritage, and also that Sri Lankan president that had, from South India, let's say. And she has Spica right on her IC in on the USA, what do you call it? Relocated chart. And Uranus being on Algol, the fixed star that's very much associated with, demonic female power, which we want to be turning around to actually understanding as a more of a reevaluation of the divine feminine, is also, I think, a big sign that we're in for a few changes. So I'm not going to go through his chart, but maybe you can slow it down for looking through the recording, because I know we have to go. And some of these things we've talked about, of course. So now, looking at the USA solar return, maybe I won't say anything about that. We have Mars on the angle. We have Pallas Athena rising at 19 degrees of Scorpio retrograde. And, you know, Ceres here opposite the sun. Again, I'm kind of seeing these indicators that are really kind of showing for the push for a feminine power to, let's say, come through that is not something that we've had before in the USA. And then the MC there is also very much Kamala's Mars. So, and sorry, and the IC is also, again, the combinations. Trump has got a 26 degrees, sorry, it's a 26 degrees MC, which is Trump's Mars, and a USA moon is down on the IC, which is also Kamala's, of course, Saturn, and Trump's part of fortune. But again, we see a lot of Donald Trump's energies coming in everywhere, but there's just much more indicators of a feminine presence sort of playing out, if that makes sense. And then just the last thing, on Inauguration Day, we have an MC, or at the time of, you know, what is it, midday, we have 26 degrees of Capricorn or Cardinal on the IC. Mars is on the IC and out of bounds at 24 Capricorn, with the peak of the Mars at 26 degrees of Cancer. So it's a pivotal time. We can see that very much more hitting off with Kamala's chart than we do with Donald Trump's chart as well, in the sense of the dynamics of, you know, being her sun and moon involved with the IC there, and Mars on the MC and IC.
We need to close.
Yeah, okay. So that's it really. Although 2 more minutes, Maurice, can I
Okay.
do? And I just look quickly at their, what do you call it? Their like we look at the Venus star point, the point that someone was born with before their birth, of the Venus Sun conjunction, or we look at the Sun Moon conjunction or the eclipse degree that happened before birth, and so on. So I just looked at the Mars conjunctions, and 22 Scorpio is for Trump, 28 Aquarius for Harris, which is of course conjunct her Saturn. And then the USA, this is really interesting. The Mars synod is 15 degrees of Aries conjunct Chiron, which is exactly where we got Ceres, you know, pivoting this year as well. And then the Mercury, we've got 9 degrees Virgo for Trump, 22 Libra for Harris, also very connected to that ascendant, and 22 Taurus for the USA. I'm sure you can do more with that as you go. And then with the Venus star point, Harris has got her pre-birth Venus star point, 28 degrees of Gemini, which is currently now at 14 degrees of Gemini, and is the active star point of 2024. Trump has got a Venus star point at 13 Aquarius, which is now the star point that is in Capricorn, because the star points move backwards, and we'll get another one of those in 2026. The USA has a 1 degree Scorpio Venus. Remember what I said about that midpoint, and Kamala Harris's Mercury is there. And so, and the interesting thing about the Venus, the Scorpio star point that is coming up, it's like the 251-year return of the USA's star point also coming up. So I think that's significant. And it is the last star point that we'll have for another 150 years or so in Scorpio, because they move to Libra and start very much highlighting Kamala's sun and moon. So there we have it, Maurice. Yeah, so a lot to look out for, but anyway, I hope that's kind of helped.
Thank you. A lot of information, and definitely take away the geodetic coordinates is fascinating. It's a really
It's just
strong
something
point.
that's really sort of standing out for me right now. And again, doing president, past president stuff, you sort of go, of course, they have to be connected to that place in more. Anyway, that's just a way to see it.
Somebody asked about the synastry, the composite of Kamala and Trump, and just a glance at it. So this is their composite, and their ascendant is 27 Cancer, right where this Pluto-Mars opposition will keep occurring on those, look at the Uranus-Jupiter on the ascendant, right where Mars is going to be retrograding. So the battle is on.
Yeah.
And another thing to keep in mind as we focus on, US dynamics is that whatever's going on in the Middle East, whatever's going on in the Ukraine may also divert, change, activate those powerful transit that we see in the candidates. Because if the Middle East, conflict escalates, it's kind of, we see how the Mars retrograding on the US North Node is not just going to be about the elections, it's also going to be about what's going on with US policy. So on this note, let us really pray for the best outcome, for what is really necessary for the US, for the rest of the world at this transition. May the most benevolent and most graceful and most important and valuable result come through. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, all panelists and all participants.
Thanks, Maurice, for organising, and thanks for everyone being there. And yeah, there's always a lot more to look at as we go.
And good night, Richard.
And thank you, Maurice. I'm really glad I attended. It was a pleasure to present, but I'm really glad I was here to listen to everything. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Beautiful. Take good care. Bye-bye.